the end of 2021 and, of course, the end of the programme. So we've reached the final week of digital teaching and learning, the pre-edit, a community of practice. And over the past 4 weeks or so, we've gone on quite a journey through a number of key topics which looked to bring us away from the front lines of our practice and rethink about how we bring education and technology together. We've had 4 topics. We've had the EdTech boom, we've had education heroes, learning revisited, and education hopes and ambitions. And of course, throughout, what we've been looking to do is critically evaluate the burning issues and considerations both in our pandemic era and what teaching and learning looks like beyond COVID, and of course as COVID still rages. And to critically evaluate, we've been using this framework, the critical and creative cycle, which is taking through, starting with our own individual practices as they stand now, through a reflection stage, through a connection stage, those critiquing stages, asking those critical questions. And then, of course, very importantly, a creation stage where we're looking to make a decision on how teaching and learning might change. Now, we're talking about teaching and learning, but of course, at the core of it has been thinking about digital technologies and how they support our teaching and learning. And we started out with this with a bit of a meta discussion, really, where we shared the tools that we've used to bring this program together. And I guess it underlines how complex a web of different tools we need to deliver a program when it suddenly goes from offline to online. And of course, we started out with quite a provocative reading, that comprehensive, if not exhaustive, blog post from Audrey Watters, which was published just as we were coming into the 2020s. And this quote is where that blog post, this is where the quote is taken from. And what do we have? The greatest trick the EdTech devil ever played was convincing people that clicking was active learning. So quite a biting critique of the role of digital technologies in our teaching and learning, and a call really for us to think about what pedagogical purpose our use of digital tools play. So before we go any further, it's time to take stock and think about whether EdTech has been a failure or indeed has caused as many problems as that blog post suggested. So at this point, to launch our poll, now let's see if I can. Gabriella, have I managed to launch it? I ask in the wings. Let's see, relaunch, here we go. Perfect. So hopefully everyone can see this at this point. So has EdTech been a failure? Yes, no, or maybe? An interesting number of people on the fence here. Without giving away too many spoilers, I can say no one said yes yet. So if you do, not to put anyone off. Okay, super. So we've had everyone, thank you. So sharing results. So hopefully you can see these now. So we have a near 50-50 split. Either people feeling that it hasn't been a failure, or a few on the fence. And I guess that was what that blog post was really provoking us to stop and question. So with that in mind then, It's a huge pleasure to introduce our panel today, which will hopefully help us move to the other side of the coin to think about when EdTech does play a really important and informative role in teaching and learning. Huge pleasure to introduce Annalisa Martin, who's head of instructional strategy at Parlay and based over in Toronto. And Annalisa has been an educator in China and Canada and joined the Parlay team to further their mission to make student discussions data-driven and inclusive. And Parlay is now used by hundreds of thousands of students around the world. And on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, a little closer to me over in cold and wet England, we have Hussein El Fadel. Now, I hope, Hussein, I should have checked how to say your surname, so forgive me. Okay, right, it wasn't too awful. Okay, good job. And Hussein is head of partnerships at Adapt in London. And Adapt is a multi-award-winning revision timetable app, really pushing personalized learning, built with teacher expertise and student insights. And the app has been running for 12 months, right, Hussein? Launch?
So January 2020.
January 2020. Oh my goodness, pre-COVID. So we're, yes, a little longer than 12 months, but just before the world turned upside down, shall we say. And Adapt went to the top of the UK Education App Store. So we have a huge amount of expertise and insights from what I see, no bias here, of course, but the EdTech tools which are taking us into our next chapter of EdTech. And the format for today, a little different to how we've been running our workshops to date. This is really an opportunity for us to take stock and have an informal fireside conversation. So we're going to take each of our topics in turn, explore them through a few questions, and invite anyone who'd like to make reflections or indeed contribute also to whack something in the chat or raise your hand, and you will very happily bring other insights into our discussions. So without further ado then, perhaps we can start out then with our EdTech boom and thinking about the journey to date. We've been looking as part of this topic, shall we say, at this SAMR model and where we can place different tools. And perhaps, Annalisa, I can head over to you to hear about your insights of where Parlay sits within this model and how you see the different functionalities of Parlay responding to this.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Annalisa. At Parlay, if you're not too familiar with it, it's basically a tool for class discussions. And so when we're looking at something like this SAMR method or SAMR chart, it really depends on how you're using the discussion. So Parlay kind of serves as both content delivery, so helping actually teach the content in your class, but it also serves as that collaboration piece as well. So really depending on how you're using a discussion in the scope of your planning, it could look something very simple like augmentation of a task. Maybe if it was an exit ticket at the end of class and you simply want students to submit something really quickly and have visibility into the other student ideas. But then if you're looking at getting students to actually respond to each other's ideas, submit their own, and then go have a back and forth conversation in a written format, that really redefines what you're able to do in the classroom. And then beyond that, one of the most popular, I guess, features on Parlay is anonymity. So students could be anonymous to each other and they're all given historical identities, which is really fun for them. Now that actually would redefine a task because you're having students now give feedback to each other's ideas and critique each other and reflect as a group without having some of those key identities in place in the discussion. So you sometimes can get a little bit further, and especially with your quieter students, sometimes it makes it, you know, a lot more accessible for them to participate in, which in some sense redefines what's possible in your typical classroom.
Superb. Thanks so much, Annalisa. And Hussein, over to you. Where do you see ADAPT and the revision timetable and that ability to, well, adapt to what's needed, right? Where do you see that sitting?
Yeah, so hi. So ADAPT is a smart revision timetable, at the moment focusing on GCSE and A-level students worldwide. The idea is that we create a plan. So we break down subjects into modules and topics and create a plan for students to combat overwhelm and anxiety. So we aren't a content-based app. We believe that there's a lot of content out there already. We also surveyed a lot of students in building this app and realized that they're not short of content, but what they are short of is direction. So we built it really as to redesign what was already there. So I'm sure that you'll remember creating revision timetables, you know, in all of our times was based on writing pieces of paper out and tearing them up when you've done too much or when you've done too little. So it really wasn't adaptable. It wasn't really efficient either. So we decided to use an algorithm to prioritize subjects that were perhaps rated more red and amber. We have a ranking system for. Hello?
Keep going, Hussein.
Sure. So when we do break down the subjects, we rate them red, amber, green. So the students will rate them red, amber, green. That's their confidence ratings. What that then allows the algorithm to do is prioritize red and amber subjects over green, using a process that you all might be aware of, which is interleaving. So we try and prioritize those red and ambers more. I would probably, and it's a bit of a long answer and introduction, but I probably fit it into modification. I was going to say somewhere, I was going to say augmentation study as well, but it is redesign because we're changing the way that you can plan, and we're taking that responsibility away from you and hopefully understanding what it is that you'd already be doing and doing it for you. So I'd like to say that this technology has allowed us to redesign what is already there as a framework. So perhaps modification.
Okay, that's really interesting. Obviously, you guys know best because you're at the helm, and I guess it comes to the categories and taxonomies and how useful they are for both sides. Both stakeholders, right? When teachers and learners are deciding which tool do I use for my teaching and learning, and also as an EdTech company, when you're deciding what value can I bring to the teaching and learning space. And I think what you've both identified is that whilst there's a danger of seeing this as a hierarchy with certain, you know, we tend to look at a top or a bottom, don't we, when things are organized like this? And that's why we've been talking about cycles for evaluation. There's value in each block. And I guess that brings us on to another part of this Samir pie, if you will, is what it's looked like over COVID, because a lot of the activity obviously has been substitution. Where we haven't been able to do what we wanted to do in the normal business of education. So perhaps, Annalisa, over to you first. Have you seen a change in how people are using Parlay, or indeed a change in what people want to use it for?
Yeah, definitely. So as you mentioned, during the pandemic, a lot of teachers were looking to online discussions as a way to bring their classes together, have them engaged and communicate with each other, and student-to-student conversations to make them more engaging in the online learning experience. Now, going back to class, of course, it's not as obvious why you would substitute in-class discussion for discussion with technology. And so what I was thinking actually when you were saying that is that sometimes I think augmentation, when it's only just slightly different from what you're actually doing, it's actually way more accessible for teachers who are busy and maybe already overwhelmed with technology, you know, competing priorities and responsibilities now with COVID and being back in the classroom. And so sometimes I think some of those redefining tasks are daunting. And sometimes it's helpful to slowly switch little aspects of it. And we see that definitely with discussions. We see that the written discussions, which is kind of like our discussion board, the online roundtable, that one is much more familiar to teachers, and they'll use that more than the other activity we have, which is the live roundtable, the verbal discussions, because that requires a lot more, Socratic seminar, maybe experience, or even the students understanding what that looks like as well.
That's really interesting. And I guess that comes back to the big learning curve, which was a forced one, wasn't it? If we think back to 18 months ago, the need to suddenly learn how it all works, and then how it augments, how does it substitute what I'm trying to do already? And those are, I guess, the first stages before you're thinking about what are the broader possibilities, what could I actually achieve? That it is actually an opportunity. And it's really hard, isn't it, to talk about the pandemic as an opportunity, but I guess there's been a forced experimentation. And then Hussein, over to you, I guess, with your more direct contact, I guess, because you're going straight to students, what have you seen from the student side in terms of how they're using EDAPT differently or looking to use it differently?
So we have had a complete opposite journey to most EdTech companies during this period of time. I guess because we were extremely popular in January 2020, became less popular during the pandemic because we're an exam-based product. So we have highest usage when exams are on, and because the first time ever exams got cancelled 2 years in a row. I mean, they weren't even cancelled in World War II. So this was quite a shock to the entire team. But we've seen people use the app to organize their lives. Now we've added features in to give them use of the app without direct exams. When we design the app, we're lucky enough that we have fairly linear specifications in the UK that don't get changed a lot. And because those specifications are set and change every 8, 9 years or 10 years, it makes our job fairly easy when it comes to renewing content. So we can design in-app usage and focus most of our time on that. So we have added a lot of features in there, such as to sort out homework or to sort out tasks. But we've had to do that because our journey has been very, very different from a substitution journey. So we aren't a substitution for anything that the system showed to lack during lockdown. We suffered a lot during lockdown, but we're seeing real traction now that we're coming back to exams. But I can't really speak so much on substitution really, because we're more an addition to things working the way that they should normally work, other than helping them organize themselves better from home, which we're kind of happy to be part of that journey as well. When students were doing exams that were teacher assessed at home, we were more than happy to help them in bringing that power to themselves, to their mobile phones.
That's really interesting, and I guess it comes back again, doesn't it, to this topic that we've been circling around, and I'm always tussling with, between intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. And of course, assessments are great when deadlines, it can be good for everyone, right? Because then it focuses the mind, and that there's certain steps you've got to take, and there's an end point that someone external to you has imposed. And I think I find it really interesting what you're saying, Hussein, in terms of this moment, I guess, where people realize the utility of not just hurtling towards that assessment date, but what it looks like to organize your learning from the starting point when you start out. And I guess that's the ideal. I mean, I say this, I mean, I wish I'd always practiced what I'm suggesting. We might all usefully do, you start a course and you think, right, if I review this right from the outset, I won't be doing that, not cramming, but even let's say later in the day, work to get the content under my belt, or whatever it looks like. So it is an interesting moment, I guess, where we're looking at education and what it looks like without assessment, and how we promote learning, and I guess give meaning to it. Because I think that was the big challenge, I guess, we were talking about in the UK, and I'm sure it was the same in Canada as well, Annalisa, in terms of what it then meant to students, teenagers who felt that the rug had been pulled out from underneath them. So part of the journey to date then, and thank you so much to both of you for those insights wrapping round the pandemic. It's so hard to talk about education these days, isn't it, without talking about a pandemic, or indeed, I guess, any topic of conversation. So I guess part of the journey is also thinking about those people who've inspired either the tools you guys are working on, or indeed your sort of motivations to join and be part of the EdTech sector. So I guess, Annalisa, over to you first. Are there particular education heroes, as we've been calling them, either people that we might recognize the name of, or people personally that have been real motivators for you?
Mm-hmm. I actually have two. So the first one is I can't not think of my grade 12 English teacher. She was the first teacher. Her name is Miss Bedio. She was the first teacher that really made English class very exciting for me and meaningful, to tie back to what you just mentioned. We read some of the classic texts, so Hamlet and 1984 and Oryx and Crake, which normally I would not have been particularly engaged in, but she made it so meaningful. And we had so much class discussion, and I felt like she brought everyone into those books and bring a piece of their own identity and relate it to those books. And then also kind of push us to grow as well and consider other ideas and other themes, which I thought was really interesting. So she completely mastered setting us up with critical thinking and discussion, and even finding our own voice in the context of those key themes across the different different texts. So she's really influenced my own, I guess, passion for discussion, but also when I'm working with teachers and we're kind of designing, the tool and the experience, I know that that's an ideal, and that's a kind of a best case scenario that I'd love to help foster. Now, in a much more, I guess, bigger context, Jordan Peterson, actually, although he sometimes has an interesting, I guess, characterization in the large aspect, he's really greatly influenced my own understanding of critical thinking and kind of pursuing the truth and having open discussions. And that has really greatly influenced, again, my decision to come and join the Parlay team, but then also help foster discussions, not only in the classroom, but in the community more generally.
Very interesting. You're now sparking up. I was thinking, how many people am I allowed to come in with? I might have to make myself a panelist and contribute too. But Hussein, over to you first.
Yeah, no, that's amazing to hear from Anna's influences, especially her teacher. That was lovely to hear. I come from a fairly teaching family, so I studied economics and went into businesses. I've worked in some EdTech companies before, and I've worked in different continents, but my mother was an English teacher. My mum's Nigerian. She was an English teacher and also has an NGO at the moment that focuses on reading in the northern part of Nigeria. She probably is the biggest influence. I've also got an aunt that works in the UN. So she has done great work previously also in Nigeria, and has worked in ministries around kind of education from a very young age. So I've always been surrounded by, on a global scale, to try and, family members trying to influence education. But what drives me to work in the space that I work in, I guess, is I think that we had a discussion, Emma, about meta learning and learning to learn. I think that the struggles that I had growing up, just personally, just understanding how I learn, and it not being over if you haven't worked that out by the age of 21 or 22. So I think that real search to find how I learn and join companies that perhaps help students like that. We have a product at the moment that helps people organize themselves slightly better if they learn at a slightly different pace. So I think that's probably what drives me to work where I work, because I am I mean, I work in partnerships. So unfortunately our CCO and CEO couldn't be here today. Our CEO got married and was on her honeymoon. So but I work in partnerships, and I've kind of brought together both sides of my life, which is one part of me that's really interested in business, and the other part that is able to wake up and work really hard in the morning towards a topic that means a lot to me since kind of I was younger. So that's yeah, that would be my influence.
It's everyone's dream, isn't it? To be, you know, I guess similarly, I've never struggled to get out of bed in the morning, and I guess that's what it can mean to work in education, can't it? Especially on ventures that are making a real difference. I'm going to take panel host prerogative, and I have to throw into the mix my Latin teacher, Mrs. Small. And she had the most extraordinary way of bringing in fictional characters or rhymes to embed what could be seen as potentially drier material, shall we say, when you're learning endings for verbs. And I never forget sort of hearing her. The lesson would start even before you got in the classroom. You'd be walking down the corridor, and it was almost like a scene setting she'd be setting up. And one day walking in, and she had pom-poms on the front of her desk, and she told us all to take 2 of these pom-poms, and she told us to line up at the back of the classroom, and then proceeded to tell us that we were cheerleaders, and each of us was one of the endings for the passive verb endings. And I have never forgotten those, and everything that she taught me, I've never forgotten. Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh is passive constructions, est, you know, all of these things that you think have absolutely no link to what you're learning, just make something. It's that moment, isn't it, when someone brings the material alive, and without abusing the prerogative. I think I pair Mrs. Small from school with Barbara Oakley's work, which is really democratizing the knowledge as to how we learn. And now following her work and the MOOCs that she's delivered and the books that she's published and the talks that she's given, I now understand why what Mrs. Small did in that moment was so effective. And I think that actually brings us nicely on to the hows. And that, you know, thinking about what Mrs. Small did for me when I was young learning Latin, she was effectively using metaphors of very visual cues to embed knowledge and create a strong memory, and also keep that interleaving, Hussein, that you were talking about. So perhaps we can, you know, delve in a little bit more about how you guys are really harnessing the power of how we know about how we learn, and how that really fires up that to be so impactful.
Yeah.
More about interleaving and anything else that you feel adapts sort of really brings to the forefront.
Yeah, I think what you've described is a big difference between telling and teaching, especially with your teacher that you had when you were younger, that you're very fond of. I think that some teachers are genuinely teachers, and unfortunately you do have some teachers that are there to kind of absorb and just relay what it is that they've read. That is the big difference, I think, between having a classroom with students that take a lot from a class and not. Interleaving is where we just want to prioritize understanding what it is that you don't know, and allowing you to investigate why it is that you don't know that, because it's not about having an outside-in approach. It's, you know, it's an inside-out approach where you need to understand that it's not because you were broken in, or you don't learn very well. That is not why you're not understanding something. Education has been widespread, but you know, there's a nucleus of where it's all started. And if you're from halfway across the world, or if you're from different continents, and you might naturally learn slightly differently than how things are taught right now, whether you're a very good reader or you understand you know, videos or picture learning more. It can hugely differ, and things are taught in a classroom to get the bulk of students across the line, especially in the UK. I'm not sure how things are in Canada, but in the UK, it is very much a standard framework for a lot of the students. So the biggest aim of ADAPT is to level the playing field, I think, between those who go to schools that are fortunate enough to investigate into each pupil more and more, and then those who go to schools that perhaps don't have the time or the budget to investigate each student by themselves. And it's not necessarily even a teacher's fault a lot of the time. A lot of the time you have so many more issues than just an individual or a personal issue. And we create different products. So we have ADAPT, the revision timetable that everyone's more aware of. But we also have schools products, which are dashboards allowing schools to intervene better instead of having to set a test and mark and come and collect later. And we also have a social product that we're building to help combat that loneliness from COVID and have a better social camaraderie experience with students from all around the country, so that there isn't as much of a gap between those from, you know, very high performing schools and those from less high performing schools or boroughs in London. I don't know whether I've actually even answered the question, but I've gone on a tangent there. But I think that EdTech is important to us at ADAPT because it needs to come together with school. You can't think that it is something there to replace or you know, entirely substitute something that's already there, because that becomes slightly dangerous, and that becomes a content war where you have I think that we're talking about the snake oil part of this slightly later, and I'll save for what I have to say about that. But I think that what's really important is to bring the power and the responsibility to the student a lot of the time as well. And I think that's what we're trying to do by building these products, is enable people to understand that it's not bad to not understand. It's actually better to not understand slightly earlier than enter your tertiary part of your working life and not understand how you understand. So that's my piece from ADAPT.
That's so interesting, and that resonates so closely with what we were exploring in terms of neuromyths, and this idea that you're either good or bad at something, and that being a label that you then carry throughout your formal education, and dare I say, even hinders you to try maybe new things, or the ability to switch sectors when you're older, or try new things, because there's that fear that I can only do what I know I have been told I can do well. And I think that's what's so powerful about what you guys at ADAPT are doing, is instilling that ability or opportunity to go on that metacognitive journey, as we were discussing the other week, at an early point. Otherwise, you get up into, let's say, tertiary education. And I think personally, I definitely went on that journey. School, I really enjoyed. I had great teachers, but I didn't really know how I knew things. I just knew that I would put the hours in and I'd, you know, keep revisiting. But no one ever said to me, do it like this, and this is why that worked, or there was times that this didn't work. And I think I could have achieved the same thing with so much less false work, that busyness. And I guess it brings us to bring in some of the thinking from the corporate sphere, I guess, Stephen Covey's time quadrant, and where you want to be placing, you want to be doing the important, non-urgent, so that planning from the outset rather than the firefighting. And I think it can feel, both as a student, as a teacher, that you're often firefighting and trying to catch up and try and hit deadlines and needs for either content delivery or, if you're the student, content onboarding, I guess, in lots of ways. And what about over at Parlay, Annalisa? What about the tools and the thinking that you guys are pulling into the platform?
Yes, yeah, I think to tie in what Hussein mentioned about how students kind of each have their own different experience as well. I think what we're trying to do really is make learning meaningful across the board, and that looks different for each student. Now, of course, it's very hard to quantify that, and there's not too much research from what I understand about what that looks like. But I think the closest thing that we could see or we pull from is John Hattie's research on visible learning. And so what we saw with his kind of meta-analysis of all these different influencers and kind of teaching strategies is that discussion is a really effective strategy or teaching strategy that you can incorporate to drive student learning and student achievement. Now we could kind of think about why that is, and my suspicion is that it makes it meaningful for students. Of course, that's not included, but that's my own kind of interpretation, and how we not only obviously work on discussions, but we've kind of looked to his work to see what other elements of the learning experience can we pull from that are really high impact and bring them into a discussion. So something we keep thinking about is reflection, and little by little at different points in the process, we've tried to incorporate more learner reflection, whether it's at the end of a discussion, maybe it's on participation, maybe it's a reflection on the content itself, or even the participation of the group. It's something that we always come back to and are trying to encourage teachers to incorporate in tandem with discussion.
I'm so pleased you mentioned John Hattie's work. That was my prop when I did the intro video for this program, with the education and technology. So thank you for tying that back in so beautifully. And I was just going to say, I put the link in the chat if anybody's curious about that research or they want to see that big kind of visual of all those different effect sizes. I find it fascinating, but I put it there in the chat. Oh, that's superb. Thank you so much. And I guess that's also that the discussion and how we measure, that is one of the challenges, I guess, that we often face where we're looking to add extra value into education and talk about the data that actually proves what is being offered is impactful. And that can sometimes be challenging, can't it? Maybe we, to come back to you, Hussein, how do you guys tackle that at Adapt in terms of measuring impact or looking and trying to chart what the platform's doing for students who use it?
I think there are two ways of measuring impact, and it depends on what it is that you hope that your tool is going to give. You can look at it from a point of view as are they progressing more? So you can look at it as are they becoming more productive? Is the app helping them do what it is that they were already doing before? And you can look at it from a perspective of, are they more confident? Is this allowing them to do other tasks better? So we like to think that you explained earlier that when you're planning to do things, or when you have a plan, a lot of your time as well is spent worrying about other things that you're not even doing at that point in time. So it's tough to measure the impact without just asking and speaking to the students, really, and just talking to them and understanding how much this means to them. We have a community of students that we're constantly speaking to. So we built this product specifically for schools. We do say this when it comes to speaking to a lot of schools about Microsoft or Google products, is that these are very much workplace products that have been dripped down to schools. Whereas we built this from students. Students have actually built this themselves. If we're to be completely honest, all we've done is ask students what they want and given it to them. So we have a community of students that we speak to a lot, just to judge things like confidence, to assess how important this has become to their life. So rather than asking them how valuable is this to you, how much would it upset you if it was removed, is often a better question, I think, to measure the importance of product. But at the same time, you can't go off that alone, because you can ask them the same question about Fortnite or about other games they're playing at a point in time, and they could really love that. So we're fortunate enough that a lot of our students participate in their rating of confidence of each topic. So it's fairly easy for us to look and draw graphs on how they're performing, whether they're jumping up confidence, or whether it's declining. So we can see both the tangible evidence and the evidence that is their happiness or their satisfaction with the app. So those are both ways that we measure it, adapt.
Brilliant. And I guess as we're talking about data and how that drives the development of the platform and the impact that you demonstrate both to the students and the schools, and indeed anyone who's looking to invest in the company, maybe this is the moment when we can bring in the snake oil discussion, given that we're talking about data and data, AI, personalization, all of these buzzwords that get bandied about in lots of different sectors. And going back to that opening quote from Audrey Watters, this danger that sometimes digital technologies, when they're brought into education, can be a little bit gimmicky and not really tackling the key pedagogical challenges we face. So maybe to start with you, Annalisa, if I may, how do you see, either in relation to Parlay and how you're communicating what Parlay does and where you counter some of the less useful tools that crop up in the education sphere? How do you see your efforts playing out there?
Mm-hmm. So I think you mentioned the word data driven, so I'll pull on that one because I think it's thrown around a lot, and we do often use that term to describe the discussions that we're trying to facilitate at Parlay. Now, I think something really important to keep in mind with that word, if you're seeing a tool that's data driven, or seeing that term being used to describe a tool rather, it's typically, from my experience, it's typically only actually data driven if you're pairing that with pedagogy and the teacher understands how to actually use that data and apply it in their practice. Maybe it's reflection, maybe it's pulling up the data for the class. And in the case of Parlay, we have a lot of visualizations after a class discussion that all of the students can look at and reflect on. Now that's kind of going to be useless. It'll just be a pretty thing to look at unless we're actually driving and asking questions. What does this mean? And having students consider for themselves what the data actually means. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, it's I guess the second step to data is education and how we can incorporate those questions so that they're easy for a teacher to grab and kind of facilitate a meta discussion after with that data. Yeah.
Superb, thank you so much. And Hussein, you've already whet our appetite. Your thoughts on snake oil in education, broadly speaking, or in relation to any of those buzzwords?
This is a really, really interesting topic. I'm lucky. I work at Adapt now, but before I have worked for EdTech companies where it might not be as disruptive, their piece of innovation, and when a company hasn't come up with a solution that is immediately impactful, you can see that unfortunately, because schools are very open organizations to get to, so you have a lot of sales teams that push products on schools that they don't necessarily need, and it's often backed by complete false evidence that this even works at all. it can be very, very, very tough because you don't become a teacher, a member of staff, or a person at reception or a school business manager, and with the idea that you're supposed to make these decisions. But because of the way that things are structured, you do have to make these decisions. And I do think that it is time that there is somebody that specifically has a role at looking at EdTech products in schools, and allowing them to be part of that ecosystem, because unfortunately you have a lot of products that are out there and that schools are almost forced to buy because of the level of skill of a salesman that comes onto them, and everything that they could provide seems like this could solve any problem that they're facing at a point in time. But unfortunately, schools aren't businesses, and you can't treat them as such. You have to treat them as schools and as something that needs slightly more government intervention, because if you have schools involved in the whole process of business and school, a business can only operate as far as the rules allow it to. It's very, very difficult to expect businesses to have a huge moral high ground and act on that, just because of the nature of the competition and how companies soon forget what it is that you should and shouldn't do. So I think that this point in time where people within schools, parents and students, are so desperate to find solutions, and that is the only reason that the EdTech boom is born, because EdTech's always been sort of there in one way, in one way or another. It's just more demanded now, which is why we're talking about it today, is that people are desperate for those things. And because people are now desperate for those things, it is a real question for the structural improvements, the rules, legislation, to talk about what it is that can and can't be approached to a school. And at the same time, discuss what government's role is in that, because you don't want a company as well to to spend 1.5 years just auditing a product either. So there is a happy balance they need to find within and between school and government, I think, and we haven't quite found that yet, because it isn't government and it isn't entirely private sector. So there is that middle ground that needs government intervention, in my opinion.
That's such a fascinating point, and actually that brings us to the broader questions, I guess, beyond education, the bigger societal debates, let's say, about misinformation, both a problem throughout the pandemic and previously, right? Who is responsible for managing it? And you've got the three parties, I guess, or more, let's say, or the 3 points. Is it the social media platforms and how they moderate the content? Is it the regulation that we need as well? Or is it the better empowerment of each and every one of us to pick through information, read laterally, and put everything that's thrust before us within a context and asking lots of questions? I'm not just saying that to bring me to my link at the bottom, but actually it is a slight segue to the link at the bottom left. So I had the huge pleasure of working with the Parlay team last year on a series of discussions talking about critical literacy and developing critical literacy through the form of discussion and scaffolding those critical stages. That link there takes you to those questions through a number of topics of digital well-being, going through news, and also what the digital world looks like today, amongst other things. And we'll also share, obviously, the links for the Parlay platform and Adapt separately. We're gradually coming up to our hour. Before I move on to a few housekeeping points for those who have joined us synchronously and those who will catch up later today, I guess the final question is, where next? So I know both of you are busily looking ahead to what the platforms do next. What is it going to look like? What's 2022 going to look like for both of you? Annalisa, over to you on your side of the pond. What will the next year bring?
Yeah. ourselves, just to tie it back to some of the key themes you've been already talking about, is that growth mindset. I think for us as, builders of an EdTech company, we're working in this space and we know that it's so important to keep that in mind, despite all of the challenges that come up and the ones that teachers are facing as well. And then with that, our key goal is really to help make discussions more accessible and easier for teachers to incorporate. Now, with that, there's so many different ways that we can go. There's lots of problems and there's many ways that we could work on that. So what we're thinking it's taking the form, as I kind of mentioned before, is a little bit more guidance on reflection and how teachers can incorporate that element. Maybe it's deeper reflection at the end of the discussion, or maybe it's just adding more scaffolds at different points in the process, specifically to get to that kind of in-class Socratic seminar style discussion. We're finding that can be really daunting. So just finding ways to make it more easy and accessible for everyone.
That's so exciting. And Hussein, over to you. What about you guys in London?
We have unfortunately we have a high amount of our users, a high percentage of users are from private schools. We do have more from public schools, but in terms of the ratio split in the UK of private to state schools, we need more state schools using our product, especially our schools product. Our push in the next year is going to be how we can get it out there as much as possible to those students, and whether that means us capitalizing more on corporate social responsibility, which is difficult when you're not a charity as well. When you are a company that is for profit, but you are using that profit to grow in the best way that you can, it is also difficult, and it's a big question. I'm sure Annalisa knows that funding in EdTech is monetizing in EdTech is a big challenge. That will also be something as we approach the new year that we'll be asking questions of as well, because growth is the goal, but monetizing is also important, because we have a lot of responsibility to do that in a fashion that is just. We have advertising that we have previously placed on our platform to ensure that the app remains free for students always. But with that comes the question of what kind of advertising are you putting on there? How responsible are you being with companies that you allow to build partnerships with your platform? And that is a big question. So growth, I wish growth was the hardest challenge, but unfortunately you have to grow in a certain manner when you are in education as well. So those are our big challenges going forward.
Thank you so much. And I think it brings us back to what it looks like to build that EdTech company, especially when both of you started with such a strong purpose. And of course, there's the funding has to come from somewhere. Not that money always drives the wheels, but it is a conversation, obviously, we have across education. And when we're talking about that SDG that we've been circling around, what it looks like to reach that goal of quality education for all, if we're going to reach there does need to be funding from somewhere. What that looks like, whether it's from the government, whether it's private investors, or indeed a blend of that, and the challenges as you're trying to reach that point, as you were saying, Hussein, with thinking what it looks like if you keep a tool free and how you manage to deliver on that. Thank you both so much. There's so many more things I'd love to ask you both. Of course, it's a very, very busy time of year, and hugely appreciative of the time you've given up to join us today. So thank you so much. It's hugely exciting to hear the journeys that you've both been on, having been sort of privy and an observer, fly on the wall up until this point, and thinking about where everything goes next. So at this point, we can move on to a few housekeeping things for those who are looking to complete the programme. Taking what we were reflecting on at the start of the programme, I have released up on the course platform their end of programme reflection, which invites you to think about how you're going to take some of our discussions and the content and change your practice in terms of how you use digital tools in your teaching and learning, or indeed which ones, and indeed maybe Adapt and Parlay will be part of that fresh blend. As a reminder, if you're looking for a certificate of participation, you do need to successfully complete that end of program reflection and the start of program reflection. And that will stay open for the next week or so. And then after that point, we will look to issue certificates and make sure all the certification is done as promptly as possible. Possibly going to be the new year, but we will keep you updated on that front. And before we close up shop for the day, and indeed the program, which is sped past so quickly, I'd love to give the final word to Savitri Emmanuel, who's been a hugely invaluable member of the team, as has Gabriella Casola, who's in the background and has done so much to bring everything together. So I'm hoping I'm going to be able to, yes, it was just coming into view. So over to Savitri, who has very generously summed up the journey that we've been on.
Greetings, everyone. Here I am once more to briefly summarize the activities and shared learning experiences of the past 4 weeks. Time surely does fly, doesn't it? What a fulfilling educational journey we all undertook during these past 4 weeks. Led by Dr. Emma Pauncefort and with the support of Gabriella Casola of 3CL Foundation, we engaged in discussions and critical reflections of the following 4 topics: the EdTech boom, education heroes, learning revisited, and education hopes and ambitions. Each week, we immersed ourselves in the critical and creative cycle as we sought to find that meeting point of digital technologies and education. Through a series of curated readings, carefully selected videos, and workshops, we looked at the boom and bust of EdTech initiatives, picked what makes an education hero, and explored what the learning sciences can tell us about how we best learn and why. We even shared our education hopes and ambitions, as well as discussed what we really mean by 21st century knowledge and skills. We looked at the Japanese term kaizen, which literally translates to mean continuous improvement, and how this relates to our role as educators in providing encouragement and motivation to empower our learners to take small, incremental, persistent, and progressive steps towards becoming a fully functioning 21st century citizen equipped with the necessary skills to be able to maximize their fullest potential. The aim of all of this? To equip us with the critical framework to use appropriate digital tools to turn our education hopes and ambitions into reality, whilst ensuring that education always comes before the technology. We all remember our special session with Dr. John Cook. Dr. Cook is the founder of Skeptical Science and the author of the wonderful book, Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change. His work focused using critical thinking skills to build resilience against misinformation. He was kind enough to share with us the theoretical framework for his book and how this concept further led to the creation of a digital tool in the form of a game for use as an open educational resource. This superb game allows us to build our critical thinking capacity and by extension, that of our learners. This game can be downloaded free on the Google Play Store. Let's talk a bit about certification. In order to achieve the certificate of participation for this course, you are asked to submit a brief reflection in about 200 words at the start of this course. The aim was to prompt you to reflect on your current practice and habits as it relates to how you use the internet and other digital tools for teaching and learning now, and how you would like this to change. Similarly, at the end of the course, you will be required to submit an end of course reflection about how your practice has or might change in response to the program experience. We will also ask you to think about how you will pass on your new knowledge. Now for some gratitude and acknowledgement. Sterling Brown once said that we must always have an attitude of gratitude. And so I take this opportunity on behalf of all participants to acknowledge and thank the following for their collaborative efforts on this initiative. The program team, led by Dr. Emma Pauncefort, founder of Dilectae, for sharing her expert knowledge and experiences in this area with us. And she did it with such finesse too. 3CL Foundation Director, Dr. Alex Grech and Gabriela Casola, thank you so much for always lending your unwavering support in this initiative. Dr. John Cook, who made us understand what can happen when we bring together inoculation theory, critical thinking, climate science, and digital tools. And of course, the Commonwealth of Learning for providing an easy-to-use platform whereby all participants can actively engage in courses such as this one in a safe learning space. And of course, to you, the participants, we thank you for your active participation in the course. Your insightful feedback meant a lot to us. It's a wrap, everyone. Thank you.
Couldn't have put it better. Thank you so much, Savitri.
Greetings, everyone.
Ooh.
Here I am once more to briefly summarize the activities and shared learning.
Here we go. Having it again. That's how much I enjoyed it. Thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure to work with everyone. I've seen different faces come in each week. Thank you to those who've joined us today. Thank you again to Hussein, Annalisa, Savitri, Gabriela, who's back in backstage. It's been quite an exhilarating journey, certainly for me, to revisit all of these topics. And Savitri, I'm going to take your attitude of gratitude quote, and I think that will keep us going as we're all trying to get through the, let's say, the next few weeks and wrap up for Christmas and spend time with families. This is the last session of the program, so all it remains for us to say alive is to wish everyone a very healthy and happy Christmas ahead. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much for having me.